The Golden Hour Birth Podcast, a podcast about real birth stories and creating connections through our shared experiences.
Childbirth isn't just about the child. It's about the person who gave birth, their lives, their wisdom, and their empowerment.
We're Liz
And Natalie,
the Golden Hour Birth Podcast, and we're here to laugh with you,
cry with you,
and hold space for you. Welcome to the Golden Hour Birth Podcast. I am your co-host, Liz.
And I'm your co-host, Natalie. And tonight we have Maria from St. Louis on. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So if you want to go ahead and tell our listeners a little bit about you and your family.
Yeah. So I'm multi-passionate. I do lots of different things. But I think having children and having pregnancies kind of helped funnel me towards a specific direction. We have like this sort of underabundance of information. At least to me, there was this underabundance of information, particularly for pregnancy and birth and postpartum, that I just felt was missing. And I went into my first birth thinking that, this will be something that will come naturally, that something will click with me. And, it'll just be like regular everyday life where, there's going to be a transition, but I'm going to be able to see the other side pretty quickly. And it didn't really work out that way. So, I had to, learn a lot between the first and the second birth. And then of course, after I had my second child, I really dove into movement specifically for pregnancy, birth, and recovery. Wow. And then I also do I've done multiple things. So I was working as a writer and an editor, and even a teacher. So I was teaching college courses, and I thought I needed to do things that were more sort of mainstream, even though I had like a very creative spirit. And I thought that the best thing for me to do would just be stick to like the paved pathways. And I did corporate work, and I was sitting down a lot, and it didn't really satisfy my need to move. I like to move throughout the day, and I like to move between buildings even. So being in the same building was very unproductive for me. But thankfully, sometime, years later, I realized that I'm just going to be me. I'm going to be weird. And I'm going to reincorporate astrology back into my life. And so I also do astrology and human design. I love esoterics. I did do a yoga teacher training back in 2012 before I even had my children. And I learned about the subtle bodies. And my yoga teacher, I love her, Beth Spindler. She's in Springfield, Missouri. She was probably one of the best practitioners for specifically for getting into the subtle bodies. So I've not had any experience that even paralleled Beth's experience for leading us from movement into Shavasana. So strict relaxation, and even having the experience of getting into the more subtle bodies. So, unfortunately, when I was pregnant, or specifically in childbirth, my first birth, I was not able to apply that relaxation because it was never connected specifically to pregnancy and childbirth. Mm-hmm. So we did do a postnatal, it was a few weekends. It might have even been one weekend where we did postnatal yoga and prenatal yoga, but it really didn't cover much. By the time I was done with those weekends, I was I still don't know what to do with a pregnant body.
Yeah.
If a pregnant body ended up in one of my classes, I don't know what I would do. So very sort of lackluster. And
you did those when you were pregnant, you said?
yeah, well, it was right before I got pregnant.
Oh, okay.
So a few years before.
Mhm.
In hindsight, a few years seems like right before. But so, like I had like this tremendous experience with being able to get into a very relaxed state and to even, alter consciousness to, embrace, pain or something that would take you a little bit out of your element. But by the time, I was in childbirth, it was like I was a blank slate. I didn't know how to apply any of that. So, so it was really tough because I think that, there's this sort of, like I said, underwhelming, what was it? An underabundance of information for movement and even relaxation techniques, at least to me. I didn't have access to those sort of specific trainings while I was undergoing pregnancy and childbirth. So in my experience, both pregnancies and childbirth experiences were wildly different. And I know that can translate to a lot of people where they're just wildly different. And, I know even if I would have had a third one, which is not going to happen, I'm done. But if I would have a third one, I know that one would be completely different too. So there's something about, that total wild card where you can't really prepare for the experience enough. But I do think that I was in this place where I wish I could have prepared better for the first. And even though I prepared a little bit better for the second, I still think that I was in a place where I couldn't really have the best experience, at least me.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. I feel like that's a lot of us. Or like, I wish I had known this. I wish I had known that. But yeah, it's like an overall experience that you're like, I missed out a little bit on.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I still do. Like, I'll still, so I'll get into my first experience. So, when I was pregnant with my oldest, I don't think I was prepared even for the first trimester, which like sat me down. I'd be like, oh, I'm going to do this and this and this today. And then I would get up and I was so nauseous and so exhausted that I could barely move. And so I was like, I don't know if I could have been prepared for this. It was just an experience that sat me down. It was like, I understood that we are in a very dense physical body, and being pregnant exacerbated that feeling. I mean, astrologically, I'm like, I have a preponderance of air. And so I don't want to be weighed down. I want to be on the move. So it was such a shock because suddenly I was like, I can no longer be on the move. And I had what I call like a bionic nose. So everything smelled horrible to me. Everything. Like, I mean, antiperspirant is still a casualty. I never reincorporated antiperspirant into my life because it was the worst smelling thing. I was just like, how do we allow this into our world? Like so many, my husband's, body wash. It was the worst smelling stuff. Now this is stuff he gets from like a drugstore. It was awful. Like I would be like, well, I gotta take a shower. And then I was like, I don't want to. All I want to do is lay down, but I gotta take a shower because I gotta go to work. And I would get in the shower and then immediately the water would hit the bathtub. The spray would hit the bathtub and that body wash would just come into my nose. It wasn't even mine, right? But I could smell it. It was horrible. And I would start crying because I was like, this is the worst smell in the world. And So it was such a shock. I mean, it was like, I couldn't even imagine that all of my senses the experience of my senses would change how I experienced life, just regular everyday life. So after the first trimester got easier, second trimester was much easier. Third trimester was really tough because I could barely move. It was just like, but I was looking forward to the birth, and I was excited because we had just moved to Kansas City, and in Springfield there was no birth center that I could use with like my insurance. It was all out of pocket. There was one birth center in Springfield, but it was all out of pocket. So when we moved to Kansas City, I was like, oh, a birth center. I can have a natural birth. And I was like, oh, I'm so excited about this. I mean, that would be a nice change to look forward to. There would be midwives, and I wouldn't have to deal with an OBGYN. I wouldn't have to, and I was very excited. I was like, I can eat during labor and like just little things like that. And so, labor began really pretty much right on my due date. I lost my mucus plug. And then, labor kind of started, and it progressed from there. And I think that I made that sort of like rookie mistake where I was like, I just need to get to the birth center because I'm in labor. And I think they sent me back home. They were like, no, you're not ready to be here. You can labor at home. And I remember the midwife telling, this was Friday evening. So, I sort of notified the midwives that labor started. My parents had come. My mom was keeping track of my contractions. They were regular. They were manageable. But I was like, I don't want to be at home. I feel like I want to be in a labor space. And I remember the midwife was like, no, you need to labor at home because you're not ready to be here yet. We would put you in triage if you came here. And I remember her specifically telling my husband, just go to sleep. Right? So he did. He went to sleep. I stayed up that whole night, as the contractions kept getting more and more intense. And, I labored that whole night. I managed the pain by getting into my shower and, just having the warm water hit me. And I remember I was singing, like I found a note that kind of hit me right, that I knew I could handle. And I sang through contraction. And, I think 5 a.m. came around and I was like, I don't want to be alone anymore. And so I woke my husband up and we went back to the birthing center. My parents met us there and I labored all day there. In fact, I was trying to even recall that second night. I don't remember the second night. But I was up for a second night. I labored that entire day. I was up for an entire second night. Wow. And went into a third day. So I was in labor for 3 days. The midwife was somebody I didn't know at all. She was the one that I never saw. And she really had this sort of wait and see approach. Nobody, including myself, knew why I was laboring that long. And we tried everything, the Foley catheter. That third day, she broke my water. There were a number of like, little natural interventions that we attempted. But every time that we did a check, and then of course we did a cervical check, mostly like during a contraction, and that was unbelievably painful. And, at that point I was just like, well, I don't know any better. I don't know. I didn't know you could consent to something like that. And you could say no. And so it really kind of put, even at the time, I didn't recognize, but it put sort of a personality quirk of mine up like under the microscope where, I'm like this, I have this people pleasing tendency.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize that would be such a big deal during a labor, but it was. So whatever the midwife told me to do was like, to me, she was like a drill sergeant and I just followed her orders. And, I just knew at one point that I needed to relax and she wanted me to do lunges. But I was like, well, she's the expert. So I'm just going to do what she tells me to do. And she wouldn't let me stay in the tub. The tub was where I felt like I could actually manage the contractions. And she was like, no, I don't want you in the tub. She's like, but you can get into the shower. So there's just little things like that where she really wanted me to be as active as possible. And mind you, I'd been up for 2 nights straight laboring. So by the time
at all?
Say that again?
Were you progressing at all?
No, see, that's the thing. I never progressed past a 5.
Oh, wow.
So I was dilated to a 5 and I never progressed past that. Nobody knew, including myself. We didn't know what was going on, but we were going into the 3rd night. And by then it was with the last intervention that they could do for me was castor oil. Mm-hmm. So I drank castor oil in yogurt and stuff. And then I started to feel like I had to poop. So every time I would have a contraction, I would run to the bathroom, throw my robe off, like, okay, I think I'm going to poop. And it never happened. So, but that being in the bathroom, that was the only place that I was totally alone. There were always people around. It's funny. I didn't want to be alone. And then suddenly I did. After, 3 days in. But that was really helpful because by the time I got into the bathroom, like every time I would run into the bathroom, I was alone. And it was like there was a voice that started to speak to me. It was like, you're not going to have this baby here. Like, it's not going to happen here. You're not going to meet this child here. And I didn't really quite understand why I was hearing this voice, but I got to this point where I was like, I feel like I need to get myself out of here. And, of course, the alternative was the hospital. But I was just like, well, okay, if I need to get to the hospital, I'll get to the hospital. So I had, the nurse came in and I told her I need the midwife, I feel like I need to leave. And she said, okay, well, she's napping. I said, okay, well, just grab her because I don't think I can stay here another night. I was going into my 3rd night, probably no sleep. And she pulled the midwife in. The midwife released us. We went to the hospital. And then, of course, the hospital, there was like this cascade of interventions, Pitocin, and then, the epidural. I did an epidural. In fact, I begged for an epidural by the time I got there. I was begging. I said, I cannot go another night without sleeping. So I begged for the epidural. And I remember the epidural technician was a resident. And so it was kind of new. And he was asking me, he's like, he grabbed the ice cubes and he was like, can you feel this? Well, he was rubbing it around my stomach. And I said, yes, I can feel it. And he was like, are you sure? I was like, yes, I can feel it. I can feel the ice cube on my skin. And so you had to go in again, do the whole procedure again. And then, yeah. So, after a certain amount of time with Pitocin, the baby's heart rate started decelerating. The surgeon busted into the room. She was like, we're going to do a C-section. And so that's what happened. So I ended up having a C-section. And, while I was under and they were, doing the procedure, they were very chatty. It was a very chatty room. And they were all kind of saying reasons why I wouldn't be able to birth vaginally. And of course, one of the reasons was, well, her pelvis is too small. The baby's too big. And another reason was, I can't remember, but that was one that really kind of stuck out to me. You know, all of the chatter, they were like, well, your pelvis is actually not big enough. And then
Were they talking to you or about you?
they were talking about me while I was, on the table.
And you just had the epidural, like you weren't knocked out or anything, were you?
No, it was just epidural. So once they decided they were going to do the C-section, of course, they upped sort of the intensity of the epidurals because, then it becomes surgery. So, so they did, they got me prepped for the C-section and everything. But this group was particularly chatty while I was in there. And, in fact, I didn't even know it was much, much later. So fast forward a little bit of time where, I'd had the baby. It felt like I had all this air sort of in between my, like my low belly. And I was like, I mentioned it to my husband. I was like, it feels like there's like air trapped in there or something. And he's like, Maria, they took your guts out. They took your guts out and they put them on a table. And then I was like, hold on, wait a minute. They took my guts out? He's like, yeah. And I said, no. That was the placenta. I had no idea. They didn't even tell me. And he's like, no. He's like, Maria, that was your guts. They took them out. They put them on a table. And then, they took the baby out. And then the placenta came out later. But, so it's just little things like that. I didn't know that they never prompted me, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. They just did what they do. And, I remember the warning, they were like, you're going to feel a little pressure when they were taking the baby out. And, I felt that. I felt the pressure. So that was the one thing I felt like they'd sort of prepped me for. And then, of course, I could tell when they took the baby out, the baby had a few words for the surgeon and for this surgeon's assistant. I remember because I was like, I couldn't see anything. It was one of those curtain epidurals, not the family friendly one. So I was like listening as intently as I could. I was like, I don't, is she going to cry? Is this going to be a, situation? She never cried. It was not anything that was alarming in any way, but she did have a couple of things that she said. One sound to the surgeon, one sound to the surgeon's assistant. It was so interesting. It was almost like she was speaking to them in defiance. And it's like, it makes sense now that I kind of know her personality. But yeah, it was such a, and one of the things that they said, oh, she's a chunker. That was like the first thing that they said. I remember they were like, she's a chunker. And then one of the things they said was that she went in crooked. So she was in my pelvis crooked. Mm-hmm. So they sort of got into more specifics. They said one half of your cervix was dilated. The other half was not dilated at all. And so that would make sense if she went in crooked. So asynclitic. Then that she wasn't it. So there was one part of her head that was actually hitting the cervix. And then she also had a hand in her mouth. So there were a few things that were working against us here, but nobody knew what was happening. And I was just like thinking, I had this horrible luck. Like I was having the longest labor that anyone could really have, and nobody knew. So my midwife didn't know. Nobody on my team knew, including myself. I didn't even know that was something that, I mean, I knew I had some inkling of like spinning babies and, creating space. And I remember doing the mile circuit beforehand. But I just don't think I was prepared for that knowledge or even that experience of understanding what happens when the baby's not in an optimal position. So she was in, and she had her hand in her mouth. And in fact, she had bruising on her lips when she was, but yeah, she didn't cry or anything. She just had a few sounded like sounds of defiance for the surgeon and the surgeon's assistant. And, of course they took her, they fixed her up. They wiped her off and they got her dressed. And then finally my husband was able to bring her over to me. He put her right up next to my face. And it was, I saw her and I said something to her. I don't really even remember what I said to her, but I could see in her eyes that she knew who I was when she heard my voice. And it was the sweetest thing ever. And then of course they took her away again. And I was shaking. I was shaking like a like a bandit. I was just like, I could not stop shaking. But as soon as he brought her over, I stopped shaking. And then of course, when he had to take her away again, then I started shaking again. And the only thing I really wanted to do was hold her. And then they were like, absolutely not. We have to get you sutured and everything. So it was like one of those experiences where I was just like, one thing led to another. And I don't begrudge what the experience, but I just knew that it could have been so much better. And I am such an information hungry person that I just knew that I was underprepared. And in fact, not just myself, but even the team that I had, they weren't even sure what to do with me. And, I felt so, I know it wasn't necessarily an oddball experience, but I felt like such an oddball because it seemed like most people that I talked to, my mother and her friends and other friends of mine that had had babies, it didn't seem like they had such a hard time with their first labor. So I was like, is something wrong with me? Did I miss a few steps here? So just having that experience was so eye-opening because there were a few things that I started to kind of piece together. Knowing that she was in there crooked, I sort of had this feeling that, well, there must be something in my pelvis. Why my pelvis wasn't, I didn't have this even pelvis. Mm-hmm. And then my nervous system. I knew my nervous system was a mess, but I didn't know why though. So I had no idea why. I know that, birth in a hospital, even in a birth center, like once you're really around anyone, it could be, your doula even, that becomes like an intervention. And if your nervous system is not sort of resilient, for whatever reason, then even the presence of that person can just take you out of, the birth focus that you need to be in. So, at that time, I really knew very little about my nervous system. So I have a background. So I survived sexual abuse as a child, and I dealt with it. Right, I did therapy, but I did talk therapy, and that's like one of those things that I learned much later that you have to get into the body. It's like around 2020, it was like the body keeps the score. Made the wrongs, right? So I had my first birth in 2014 and my second one in 2017. So I was just like, well, now I understand why maybe even nervous system wise, why my body was ill-equipped for an event like birth. because I never actually got into my body to sort of excavate the trauma that I had experienced as a child.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's an ongoing thing. But I do know that when it comes to childbirth, pregnancy even, that any nervous system maladjustment can really affect the outcome of birth. Of course, I had no idea that would even come to be in my first birth. So, recovery with her was pretty easy. However, or not easy. It seemed like it as time went on. I mean, I was recovering from a C-section. Okay. That's just really painful. I had low supply, so I wanted to breastfeed. I had low supply. And at that time, I didn't know that you could combo feed. And so the first time I saw her getting formula and seeing her like just take that down, like, I was like, oh my God, my child is hungry. And maybe I should just do formula because there's not enough milk, So, we breastfed for a few months and then she switched to formula. I didn't know you could combo feed. I learned that the second time around. And, so it seemed like it was pretty straightforward recovering from her birth. However, I knew nothing about scar tissue release. So I had no idea that that's a thing, that when you have a C-section, that you should go in and try to massage and, break up some scar tissue and things. And, and it's never too late, So if someone is like, well, I had a C-section like 10 years ago and I never did scar tissue release, you can go in and do it. It's not a big deal. But if it is something that you want to add to your repertoire of things to do because it's so important. It can, the scar tissue can create adhesions and it could, latch on to other organs and it can affect subsequent pregnancies and, which I suspect it did, affect my, my birth. So I ended up with a VBAC the second time around. I was so proud of that VBAC. I was determined to fix the imbalance in my pelvis. So when I got pregnant with my second, so I had a very sedentary job with that one, which I know affected me. I ended up with some pubic symphysis pain. So it was like one of those things where I couldn't, my pubic bone hurt all the time. And I knew it was because I was sitting a lot. And, the aesthetics of this, workplace was kind of ridiculous. It was like everything had to look the same. They were like, you absolutely cannot sit on a birth ball. Even the lactation room that they put in, it had to look like the rest of the place. So you couldn't even have like a comfy chair. It was like this. It had to look like there was like a chair that had to look like it was anywhere else in the building. I mean, it was ridiculous, but, yeah, I digress. So I was very sedentary and I know that affected me, but I know I think I was 30 or 32 weeks pregnant when all of a sudden I could tell my child was hiccuping upward instead of downward. And I was just like, oh no. I was like, I cannot have a breech baby because I am determined to do a VBAC. So I started doing chiropractic work at that point, Webster technique. And I was doing prenatal yoga. So I wasn't teaching it, I was taking it. And so I was doing that to prepare my body for the birth. And I think that helped a ton. The one thing that I swear by was the prenatal massages. Because I knew, see, this was even before I knew I still had trauma in my body. I knew that I needed to downregulate my nervous system and relax. because that was the one thing I couldn't do with my first. Couldn't actually relax between contractions. And I was like this. I had my shoulders up to my ears. Like everything that you do to present a tense body, I was doing in my first.
Yeah.
I knew I was like, I have to do something to relax my nervous system. And I did these prenatal massages regularly, like every other week.
That's awesome. Good for you.
And I would leave work and I would do the 90 minutes.
Oh my God.
I was like, I am doing this. Yeah. And I would get so relaxed. And it reminded me of my yoga teacher training with Beth. The way she would get us into our subtle body. So my ability to get into that meditative state that I cultivated during my yoga teacher training, that's what I was doing on the massage table. And see, I couldn't do that myself because probably the trauma. I just couldn't do it myself. So I needed someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when too, it's like, I didn't even realize even that is a myth that we sort of have to dispel. You don't have to do it yourself. You can get other people to assist you, especially if you kind of know what you need. I know a lot of people are coming into this experience and they don't even know what they need. And I was certainly that way in my first. Even the second. I mean, I know now I can sort of tick these little blind spots that I had, even with the second. But yeah, I would get so deeply relaxed. And that was exactly what I needed, because when I went into labor, they were trying to get me to schedule a C-section because they were like, you're geriatric pregnant. You've had a C-section. So why don't we just schedule a C-section again? And so I remember when the doctor called, I happened to be in the shower, and thankfully I missed that call because I was still in my people pleasing phase, and I probably would have been like, I wouldn't have been able to say no. And then I would have been like scheduled for a C-section against my will, because that's just where I was. And so thankfully I missed that phone call. I didn't even return the call. And I went into labor 3 days after. So I was 40 weeks and 3 days. And, I had to go to the doctor to do an ultrasound. Because that's what they'd scheduled. And of course, at that time, I was like, well, I guess I have to do this, right? Because it's what they scheduled. And so right when we pulled up into the parking lot of the doctor's office, I got out of the car, my water broke. So my water was like leaking out of me. We went up to the, doctor, and there was like amniotic fluid just leaking everywhere. And so they put me right into the hospital. And if I would have known, that I would have gone 18 hours without a meal. No, it was 24 hours. 24 hours. Because I ate before we went to the doctor, but I didn't eat again after that, because of course you can't eat when you're in the hospital. So I ended up staying at the hospital. They put me up in labor and delivery, and it was, I thought they were VBAC friendly, but really they were VBAC tolerant, meaning that there were certain policies that they had to follow. And of course, once I was in the room, somebody came in and they said, you need to be on the monitors. So we're going to have to strap you in. And I said, okay, if you're going to strap me in, then I'm going to do an epidural, because there's no point in me being stuck to a bed, feeling every single contraction. So I ended up doing an epidural there. And then once I stalled at a 5, I freaked out a little bit, because I was like, no, this is my lot in life. I'm going to be second of 5 and I'm going to be laboring for 3 days. So they Pitocin, of course. Then the Pitocin, I was like, even on the epidural, I could feel those contractions. But I had cultivated that ability to relax in between contractions. And I think that's what saved me.
Yeah.
And thankfully, they did have a peanut ball, and there was a really sort of a friendly nurse who was pregnant herself, who kept changing positions, helping me change position. And the funny thing was that there was one position where I really started to progress. It was on my side, and I had one leg up on the peanut ball, and at this point in time, I'm sort of analyzing because I know now. I was like, was my hip an extra, or was I an external rotation? Was it extended? Like, these are all things that I learned afterwards. But there was one position in particular where I progressed like so steadily. And I think it's called flying cowgirl, but most people don't do that correctly. So I was probably doing like this incorrect version of flying cowgirl. And that's what progressed labor. And then when I was completely dilated, completely effaced, I think it was like 7 a.m. So I had labored all night. And then the nurse like notified the doctor. She's ready. She had me push once, and it seemed like the baby would come in like a few pushes. So he said, okay, let's just have her down labor, because he was coming in to the clinic at 9. So we were on the doctor's schedule at this point, because he was just waiting to get to the clinic. So they had me down labor, and then I ended up pushing for like an hour and 45 minutes, which I've heard is not that bad, but to me it was horrible. It was so long because it was purple pushing.
Yeah.
Where,
how long those minutes go by. Like when you're in it, those minutes are just like turtle minutes.
Right? They're horrible. And then hold your breath, and then so on your back, on the closing the sacrum,
Yeah.
And then that's when I realized too, that I didn't know this at the time, but I knew after that I had a tight pelvic floor, because it seemed like the baby was going to come out in 1 or 2 pushes, but got a little held up. And then I did tear a little bit on one of those pushes. I was purple pushing with an epidural, so I couldn't even really feel. But I did feel when it tore, though. That was what's really interesting. I could feel it tearing. But I do attribute that to not doing my scar tissue release, because it sort of pulled up all of the tissue in that area. So on the right side. And so I suspect that I might have tore because of that. I never had done the scar tissue release. So there were just certain things, like physical things, that, I knew that I didn't have the information afforded to me at that time. And then, of course, once I'd had the experience, I was like, well, these things didn't add up. And then recovery was much harder with him, because I was older and much more tired. And same thing, low milk supply. So I was freaking out, because I was like, I don't think I ever really produced more than 12 ounces a day. It was just something that had I don't know. I still don't know what the underlying reason for that was. But I was seeing a lactation consultant that said, oh, you can just breastfeed and then give it 12 ounces of formula afterwards. And I was just like, yay. It was the best thing, because I was just like, okay. So I ended up breastfeeding him for a year and a half. So I was so proud of that, because I was like, that's exactly what I wanted to do. And in fact, I had to leave my job, because I requested at the end of my maternity leave, I said, can I stay home? Because I have low supply. And I know that if I come back, that I might lose all of the work that I did. And it was such profoundly hard work. That was probably the hardest I'd ever worked in my life, because it was like night and day where it was breastfeed and then pump and then bottle feed. It was all of that. It was all of that at once, every single, even at the 12-week mark when returning, when I was supposed to be returning back to work. And they said, well, no, we never negotiated that when you were hired. They said, we have a lactation room. I said, listen, no, the room's there and that's great. But I was like, I can't have the room. I need the baby. That's the only way that this is going to continue. And so they were like, well, they basically made me quit. They kind of forced me out. I said, I have to do this because I know it's good for the baby and I know it's good for my own health if I continue breastfeeding. So that was another one of those things where I was just like, had this like sort of exposure to the various systems that work against us, that you have no idea. You have no idea that you would ever meet that resistance. And so, I was dealing with a lot at that time, not just, for that in the healthcare system, but also the judicial system. We were dealing with that. So it was just a number of things where I was just like, there's way too much, just even administratively that I'm having to deal with here that someone who just gave birth should not have to deal with. Yeah. And it's, right. The social worker that comes into the room to issue the birth certificate. Like, I had no idea what was going on. I mean, I could barely stay awake. I'd been up for 24 hours, but with no food. Right. So it was just, it was such a ridiculous, experience, birthing in a hospital. I felt really supported in so many ways. And I was very happy that I had the VBAC. But also it was so, there were so many obstacles and so many hoops to jump through. Mm-hmm. So it was, I would never recommend it to anyone, really. Be like, oh, I mean, I would never deter somebody from that decision. I support anyone's decision on what they do. But if somebody were to say, Maria, would you recommend a hospital birth? I would say, absolutely not. Or even a birth center birth, I would be like, well, you need to make sure that your team sort of has, one foot in the year that we're in, like some updated skills, because I couldn't believe with what I know now that my midwife had no idea that the baby was in a less than optimal position and let me labor for 3 days.
When did you transfer care from the Springfield to Kansas City?
Well, we had moved, so it was third trimester though. So I was in my third trimester because we were in Springfield, but then my husband's daughter, he has a daughter, and his daughter's mother got diagnosed with breast cancer. And so we decided to go up to Kansas City to help her get through that.
Sure.
And I mean, I loved living in Kansas City. So that was kind of like, I was like, oh, sure. Yeah, let's go. And I still, even to this day, I'm like, I still loved living there. It was one of my favorite places to live. And in fact, I was born there. So
it's fun.
So my daughter and I were born in the same place, not the same hospital, but in the same place.
That's sweet. I love Kansas City too.
Yeah.
Did you like have a doula with that birth center?
No, I couldn't afford one. And so I have no doubt that having a doula might have helped, but I still think that unless somebody knew that the position of the baby, that it still would have been just as hard as it was. You know, I experienced this amazing So after I had my second, I had been sort of I'd been following this person called Katie Bowman, and she's a biomechanist. And she was covering topics like diastasis, the separation of the six-pack muscles, and things like that I appealed to me as somebody with a movement background. And thankfully, she shared an account. I think it was an Instagram account of somebody who'd done the training with Katie Bowman. And then this person ended up being like really into, she was a doula. She's a doula. So she was really into preparing the body for pregnancy, or at least moving in a way that was specific to pregnancy. And she had a baby not that long after I had mine. So I was really interested in her content. I would watch her content a lot. And really after I had my first, I was kind of eager to get back into exercise as soon as I could. And I was really kind of fearless. I didn't think really there was anything I needed to watch out for. However, when I had my second, I was not fearless. I suspected that I had a diastasis, but I never got diagnosed. And in fact, I still haven't gotten diagnosed. Ended up with a hernia a few years after I had my last child, an umbilical hernia. And even though I was trained as a Restore Your Core teacher, so that was my first training that I did that was specific towards, so basically Restore Your Core is for the postpartum body. And then, so thankfully that was an online program. And when I was feeling like I was afraid to do really anything, I didn't do anything. I didn't do yoga. I didn't do, like regular sort of conventional fitness. I did nothing. I did walk. I did walk. I remember walking with my child, and I knew like I was familiar enough with Katie Bowman that I was like, I'm going to try to hand carry my child. So I did. So we would go for little walks, and I would carry him in my arms. I used a carrier with my first child, and she loved that. We would walk over Kansas City in the carrier. But I was very fearless with her, or after I had her. But I was very reticent when I'd had my son because I knew something was wrong with my core. But I didn't know what, and I never got a diagnosis. And when I tried to get a diagnosis, it was shooed away. Like this person was like, I said, I suspect I have a diastasis because my back hurts and I'm constipated. And I just feel really weak in my core. And then she was like, well, I suppose we could do an ultrasound, but I don't really want to do that. She's like, just wait a few more weeks and see if it gets better. Maybe you'll poop again. So it was like one of those things where it was just like, and I sort of knew at that point, I was like, well, I was familiar with Katie Bowman. I had been following Lindsay McCoy. So Lindsay McCoy and Lauren was partners with Lauren O'Hayan. Lauren O'Hayan is the one who created the Restore Your Core program. So as soon as they were working on a pregnancy program, but they released it at the time that I had my son. So, of course it was too late. But then as soon as I realized that there was a postpartum program, then I did that. I bought that program pretty quickly, and I did that religiously. Like several times. I went through the entire Restore Your Core, like a 12-week program.
Yeah. That's awesome.
And then the then she was training teachers, and I knew immediately. I was like, okay, I'm gonna do that because I felt like I could be something to someone that I needed at that time. So, my skills have continued to build. So not just with the postpartum program, but also with preparing the body for pregnancy. So then Lauren O'Hagan and Lindsay McCoy, they partnered together. They created this program called the One Strong Mama program. But now it's known as the Body Ready Method, where it's a prenatal and postnatal program for people that are just wanting to do the exercises, but then they also train practitioners. So that was something that I did as well, was the Body Ready Method and Restore Your Core. And it's phenomenal because it is it's movement that is specific to pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery.
Yeah.
So things to do, like just how you stand makes a difference. Knowing how to hip hinge, just little things like that. Like being able to put your joints in, very specific positions, like external rotation and then internal rotation, and how each of those movements affect the position, or how the pelvis is such a dynamic entity that it's not even static. So you could just, even with movement, you can reposition the pelvis. You can open the inlet with specific movements. You can open the outlet with specific movement, even the mid pelvis. So, and creating it like this sort of supple pelvic floor. So, so that's what I dove deeply into after I had mine. And of course, now my head is just filled with information that I know I was craving.
Yep.
Where I had my children.
That's amazing. So do you like run your own course, or are you more of like a entity of the program that they do?
Yeah. So basically I used whatever I learned from that, and I work usually 1-to-1.
Okay.
Classes have been much harder to get going here in St. Louis.
Yeah.
It sort of blows my mind because there's such a gap here in St. Louis for the pregnant and the postpartum body, but it doesn't seem like people are really that interested in changing that. So I know here in New City, there is somebody, who has the Matera method. And
Abby.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
she teaches classes and stuff here. And I'm in New City too. So she teaches classes, and she's got a studio, and she's got an online program, which is amazing.
Yeah.
But really outside of that, there's not much. And in fact, I was really surprised when I moved to St. Louis, because my husband's from here. That's why we're here. That I was asking around, and I was asking people that have been in St. Louis for a long time. I was like, are there any birth centers? Like who can I talk to here?
I know. Like the only one is in the hospital. There's one in like North County.
Yeah.
But yeah, I know. It's more like that or home birth.
Right. So it was funny because my husband ran into one of his college buddies recently. He was at Blueprint getting coffee.
I love that place.
I did too. It's my favorite place in St. Louis. One of my favorite places, because it was the first place we went to when we moved here.
Yeah.
But he ran into his an old buddy, an old college buddy. And I remember I was like waiting for coffee. He said, guess what? He's like, I ran into a friend, and guess what? His wife is a midwife, and she has her own birth center. So I forget what it's called. I think it's called Heart to Heart. So they do exist, but they're probably not as popular as maybe. So as maybe is that we can get acquainted with very easily. And I think I'm in that position too. A lot of people don't know exactly what I do. Like movement, like specifically for pregnancy and childbirth and the recovery. So every so often someone will find me, and it's funny because I do less pelvic floor work than I do astrology sessions because it seems like St. Louisans love astrology.
I love astrology. I'm really getting into it.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. I love that it is as popular as it is and more people are into it because when I started studying astrology when I was 13. And at that time, it wasn't, it wasn't very well, it was popular, but it wasn't something that you would go around saying, oh, I study astrology. So I kept it sort of secret for a long time. I would not really volunteer that information.
Yeah.
And, so I do. So I love to do the movement work because it's such an integral part of who I am. I've always done movement, and I'm definitely a body nerd. I love to know more about the body and what it can do. And thankfully, we have biomechanics. We even understand the female pelvis better, and really any pelvis. It's like there are so many different kinds of pelvises, and you can change just depending on what you do with the pelvis. You can change what the pelvis is doing too. It's amazing. But then I also love astrology and human design and esoterics. And so I kind of try to interweave those things. But I can't, every so often there will be someone who's like, I just want to do pelvic floor stuff. And I'm like, okay, great. It's we can do that. We can, and then so every so often someone will come up to me like, I just want to do an astrology reading. I'm like, okay, great. We can do that. So it's to me, I think they're all like self-awareness tools.
Yeah.
The more self-awareness you have, and there's an overabundance of information for astrology, as you know.
Yeah.
You could study astrology your whole life and still not see everything that there is. Like you won't even come into contact with it. When it comes to the female body, there's this wanton gap. And, it was like, that's one of my missions, I think, is to close that gap. Like, a better understanding of what we need, not just health wise, but like in our communities, in our society. And, I don't think people are really prepared to, I don't think people are prepared to, I don't want to, there's no other way I can say this, to butt heads with all of the entities.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a baby.
Mm-hmm.
In the American system.
Mm-hmm.
It's mindful.
Yeah, we totally agree. Where can people connect with you and find you?
Yeah. So, I'm on Instagram. That's where my online interstate is right. Real estate. Online real estate is right now. I did have a website, but I took it down recently. But yeah, in Instagram, and then email is really the best way to contact me. That's where I schedule sessions and everything.
Well, wonderful. Well, perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your two very different but yet empowering births, and finding like what your real passion lies.
Yeah. And thank you so much. Like, I love your podcast, and I love doing, I think the world of both of you for doing what you're doing, and that this is such a beautiful, it's such a beautiful way to like sort of bring people in, one at a time into like the realities of it. I love the stories of some of the, everyone has this really beautiful story, but some of the stories that you brought in are just, amazing, heartbreaking. And it's so good to have that, those stories come to our ears. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That really means a lot. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on, and we'll see you next episode.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Golden Hour Birth Podcast. We hope you've enjoyed our discussion and found it insightful and beneficial. Remember, the Golden Hour Birth Podcast is made possible by the support of listeners like you. If you appreciate the content we bring you each week, consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast platform or sharing the show with your friends and family. Your support helps us reach more people and continue creating valuable episodes. If you have any questions, suggestions, or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us on our website, www.goldenhourbirthpodcast, or connect with us on social media. We value your feedback and want to make sure that we're delivering the content you want to hear. Before we sign off, we'd like to express our gratitude to our incredible guests who joined us today. We are honored that they trust us enough to be so open and vulnerable. We're grateful for their time and willingness to share their stories with us. If you're interested in taking the conversation further with us, join us on our Facebook group, The Golden Hour Birth Circle. We'll be back next week with another exciting episode, so be sure to tune in. Until then, stay golden and remember to take care of yourself. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Golden Hour Birth Podcast. Bye!